When I speak to you here, let me put it utterly bluntly, I am sure that God has accepted me. Now, if Christianity were merit-based, that would be utterly arrogant. What right have I to say that God has accepted me? The key to Christianity is what lies at its heart, and that is the cross, where Christ died and rose again. And that's part of the evidence that brings me right into the Christian orbit, because what Christ has done for me, I don't find anywhere else. You see, Jesus Christ does not compete with any other religion when he claims to be God incarnate who died for us and rose again, because nobody else claims that. And that he has the authority to pronounce us accepted by God, not at the final judgment, but now. That is the dramatic difference. And that's why I'm a Christian. Because that is utterly unique. It means that I can live for him, not to gain acceptance, but because I've got it. Do you remember the girl I mentioned that I saw? You'd need to know how we got engaged, wouldn't you? And married. Well, I gave her a nice book. It was a cookery book. And I said to her, you know, Sally, I would very much like you to be my wife. Now, it's going to be like this. You know that I love Apfelstrudel. I really do like it. Now, if you keep the rules in this book, it's on page 63, by the way. If you keep the rules in this book for, let's be reasonable, say 40 years, I will accept you. Otherwise, you can go back to your mother. Now, you laugh. Why do you laugh? Because that's the way millions of people think of God. If I behave, you'll accept me. Millions of people in all kinds of religions, including professing Christians, think that way. But no, it didn't happen that way. I did give her a cookbook, but not in order to gain my acceptance, but because she had it. That's what sets people free to live within a marriage. They're not cooking to gain acceptance, are they? They're cooking to express their love. It's exactly the same with God. You wouldn't insult a fellow human being by telling them that their relationship depends on their performance. In my undergraduate days, really trying to challenge the resurrection as a historical event. And came away absolutely convinced that this was a fact of history on which I could base my life. One thing that's repeated in the Gospels, frequently repeated, is the detail of Christ's trial. And I've often wondered in those days, why so much detail? Until I realized that he was put on trial for being a terrorist in modern terms. And so seriously did the Roman authorities take his claim to be king that the Roman procurator, Pilate, decided to do the investigation himself. That was a most unusual procedure. And when he talked to Christ, are you a king then? In other words, are you a political enemy or threat to my rule and the rule of Rome? He said, well, you said it, I am a king, but not in the sense you mean it. And then he explained, he said, to this end I was born, and to this end I came into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. And Pilate, listening to this, realized something. He was pretty sharp. He immediately saw that Christ was innocent. If he professes to be king of the truth, Pilate knew, as well as most of us will know when we think about it, that the one thing you cannot impose by violence is truth. So Pilate goes out and says he was innocent. But Jesus explained the nature of his government. Why was he not a political threat? He said, if I were your sort of king, my servants would have been fighting. so that I should not be delivered to you. But they weren't fighting. My kingdom is not now from here. And that was so important to me, coming up to Cambridge, realizing that the stance of many of my fellow countrymen, both Protestant and Catholic, was not Christian at all. Because to take up weapons like AK-47s and bombs to protect or advance Christ's message is not being Christian, it's being anti-Christian. And I remember explaining this to Christopher Hitchens years later, who was vehement about the wars caused by Christianity. And I said, Christopher, you clearly haven't spent any time in the company of Jesus Christ, because he would have stood on your side in this. He repudiated it all. So those were very big lessons coming up here. And the truth, that truth question, has lived with me all my life to now. I was interested in truth, cost what it may actually, because my parents lived and they discovered truth in the Bible, and that's where I discovered it as well.
Now, I want to stick on Cambridge.
This opening section establishes the intellectual and moral framework for everything that follows. Lennox begins not with abstract theology, but with a historical scene, the trial of Jesus before Pilate. What might appear as a minor biblical detail becomes, under careful reflection, a profound statement about the nature of truth and authority. Pilate's question, "Are you a king?" is not religious curiosity, it is political calculation. He wants to know whether Jesus represents a threat to Roman order. Jesus' response reframes kingship itself by declaring that his kingdom is not of this world and that his mission is to bear witness to the truth. He removes violence from the very definition of his authority. Pilate immediately grasps the implication. Truth is not something that can be enforced at the point of a sword. You can compel behavior, but you cannot compel belief. This insight cuts deeper than a Christian moral lesson. It exposes a universal philosophical principle. Wherever force is used to establish truth, truth has already been abandoned. Violence may silence dissent, but it cannot generate understanding. It can impose conformity, but it cannot produce conviction. In that sense, coercion is not a sign of confidence in truth. It is evidence of insecurity about it. Lennox then draws a hard but necessary line. When Christians take up weapons to defend or advance Christ's message, they are not being inconsistent with secular ethics alone. They are being inconsistent with Christ himself. This is not an argument against political engagement or moral seriousness. It is an argument against confusing Christ's kingship with earthly power structures. A kingdom grounded in truth must operate by persuasion, witness, and sacrifice, not intimidation. The reference to Northern Ireland is especially significant. Lennox is not critiquing others from a safe distance. He is judging his own cultural and religious inheritance by the standard of Christ. That act gives his argument moral credibility. When he tells Christopher Hitchens that Jesus would have stood against religious violence, he is not excusing Christian history, he is interpreting it. Failures committed in Christ's name do not define Christ's teaching. They reveal departures from it. This section also quietly introduces a theme that will recur throughout the lecture. Christianity, if true, is not merely another ideology competing for dominance. It is a claim about reality that invites assent, but refuses coercion. That refusal is not weakness. It is fidelity to the nature of truth itself. A truth that must be enforced by violence is already a lie. As an opening, this segment sets the tone for the entire discourse. It tells the audience what kind of argument this will be, not a defense of power, but a defense of meaning, not an attempt to conquer opponents, but an attempt to clarify reality. Before Lennox ever speaks about science, fine-tuning, or resurrection, he anchors the discussion in a simple but demanding principle. If truth is real, it must be offered, not imposed. Let us now continue with the debate or discussion.
So you've made this transition from, frankly, quite a rural part of Northern Ireland. The boy arrives at an elite university. He's met off the station by a farmer who takes him to church the next day, and then he's into this elite university. How did you find your time in Cambridge impacted your thinking and your faith?
But you've missed something, Richard.
I normally do. That's
On
why
day 2 in Cambridge, that farmer, who became a great friend, took me to church. And there were 4 girls sitting there, 4, 3, 2, 1. And they were glorious, especially the eldest of them. And I've been married to her now for 56 years. So that was day 2. Day 3, I was inducted into the college just across the road, Emmanuel College, where I stayed for 7 years. It was, of course, very daunting. I never thought I'd get into the university here because in those days they didn't recognize the A-levels I'd done, and they had this ferocious institution where if you wanted to get into Cambridge, you had to come here for a week and do some absolutely grueling examinations. And I would hear people muttering as they came out, I got 5 questions done, all this kind of stuff. And I'd managed to attempt 2 and all this kind of thing. And I thought, that's the end of it. I've had a week in Cambridge, I'll never be here again. So it was quite a surprise to find that I'd got in. I got in indeed with some money, £40 a year. That was really big stuff in those days. So all these questions were whirling around. And now here I was in this wonderful city, able to ask people about them. And I deliberately started week 1, day 3. I started asking people, seeking them out actually, in my own college who didn't share my worldview. Because I found, first of all, it's much easier to ask questions than answer them. And secondly, that you really get to know people by asking them questions. Asking them what makes them tick, what they regard as important, where their ethical principles come from, and so on. I must have been an absolute nuisance, you know. But somehow, I got talking to a lot of people, not only fellow students, but academics, but mainly my fellow students. And so I felt really what's behind this is what's written here. See, I believed that. That command of Christ himself, go into all the world. Well, here I was, and all the world was around me in Cambridge. And it is a powerful statement of what I believe is the fundamental Christian commitment to speak and nowadays write about my faith and argue it in the marketplace, in the public square of this world. So I did that. And what I discovered was people were really interested. Many people had never heard, and so it was information they needed. But people had all sorts of questions, and before long I was utterly bombarded by questions.
Right.
And I loved
So you're
it.
going to be bombarded by another question.
Okay,
because,
right.
John's got a bad back.
This section looks like a light biographical bridge. Cambridge, a farmer, a church visit, a marriage story, but it carries a serious intellectual point. Lennox treats the university not as an enemy territory to fear, but as a mission field of minds. The moment he says, in effect, all the world was around me in Cambridge, he is reframing the public square as a legitimate arena for Christian witness. That matters because many Christians either withdraw from serious intellectual engagement or enter it with the wrong spirit. Notice his method. He intentionally sought out people who did not share his worldview. That's not a marketing strategy. It's an epistemic discipline. He is suggesting that faith becomes brittle when it never meets resistance, and it becomes mature when it learns to listen, question, and respond with clarity. The line, "It's much easier to ask questions than answer them," is not humility for show. It's a practical model for dialogue. Questions reveal what people actually believe, what they value, and what they assume about meaning, morality, and truth. In other words, Lennox is practicing a kind of intellectual hospitality. He enters another person's world long enough to understand it before he challenges it. But here is the key. This posture only works when the Christian does not treat the other person as a target to defeat. He says he got to know people by asking them what makes them tick, where their ethical principles come from, what they regard as important. That is the opposite of caricature. It refuses the lazy shortcut of labeling someone atheist, skeptic, or liberal and assuming you already understand them. If modern discourse is collapsing, it is often because we skip this human step. We argue with a label instead of a person. At the same time, Lennox is not endorsing a soft relativism where everyone has their own truth. He is motivated by a conviction. Christ's command to go into all the world includes the marketplace of ideas. That means Christians should not be anti-intellectual, but it also means they must resist a different danger, the temptation to turn argument into ego. If your identity depends on winning debates, you will inevitably become aggressive, selective, or dishonest with evidence. Lennox's model implies a different identity. You can engage publicly without desperation, because your worth is not hanging on applause. There's also a subtle ethical claim embedded here. Public witness includes public reasoning. He talks about speaking, writing, and arguing in the public square. That is a refusal to privatize faith into mere feeling. Yet he pairs that with relationship. He learned people by conversation, not conquest. This combination, conviction plus curiosity, might be the most needed moral posture in contemporary culture. Strong beliefs without curiosity become cruelty. Curiosity without conviction becomes confusion. The segment argues for both. So the sharp takeaway is this. Cambridge did not create Lennox's faith, but it did test and refine it by forcing him into real encounters with alternative worldviews. And that kind of refinement, when done with patience, precision, and genuine respect, does not weaken Christian witness. It strengthens it. Let us now continue with the debate or discussion.
We're very, very grateful that he's done tonight. And he said to me earlier, so I'm not sure I'm going to last 45 minutes. Well, you've just taken 20 minutes on the first two questions, so we could be here for a while. Now, I'd like to raise with you two public intellectuals, actually, because I want to go down this route of you, people who you've loved talking to and debating with, some you've met, some you haven't, but who've radically challenged the Christian position. I would like to start with Stephen Hawking. Two quotes for you from Hawking. You don't need a God to create it. The universe is the ultimate free lunch. And my second quote, because there is such a law as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. What says John Lennox?
Well, he's puzzled, first of all, because I was shown a copy of his book before he published it. It's absolutely fascinating, this claim to be able to explain the universe and say that we don't need a God to create it. It's the ultimate free lunch. I couldn't help thinking at the time that no lunch is ever free. Somebody's got to cook it and prepare it and all the rest of it. They don't just pop into existence, free lunches. So what he kind of meant is not entirely clear to me. Something we're given as a given. Well, that would be true from my perspective. The universe is a given, but there is a giver. And he didn't answer the question. And I've met this many, many times from academics. With variations. Peter Singer was another person I debated, and he put it slightly differently. He said, we don't need a God to explain the universe. And it was statements like that, and that of Hawking, that led me to investigate, what do we mean by an explanation? And that's a very important thing, because there's a lot of thinking today that science explains everything. And, it's very funny when you investigate it. I often illustrate this. What does the law of gravity explain? I used to think it explained gravity, but it doesn't. Nobody really knows what gravity is. But what the law of gravity does is enable you to do calculations on massive bodies and how they behave in respect of each other. But it doesn't tell you what gravity is. And Newton realized that. So that even a so-called scientific explanation is very rarely complete. Now, let's take Hawking, because Hawking was a genius, absolute genius. I can remember him well in the days before his disease began to strike him. He's just a bit ahead of me in Cambridge, and light years ahead of me in his brain power.
This segment is a masterclass in exposing how easily modern discourse confuses a punchline with an explanation. Hawking's phrases are memorable, but Lennox asks a deeper question. What do we mean when we say we have explained something? That is not a minor semantic issue. It's the hidden hinge on which many popular claims about science and God turn. This segment is a masterclass in exposing how easily modern discourse confuses a punchline with an explanation. Hawking's phrases are memorable, but Lennox asks a deeper question. What do we mean when we say we have explained something? That is not a minor semantic issue. It's the hidden hinge on which many popular claims about science and God turn. Consider the line, "The universe is the ultimate free lunch." Lennox does not merely disagree, he presses the logic. No lunch is ever free. That sounds like a joke, but it carries a philosophical point. Free is not an explanation. It's a conclusion smuggled in without argument. In ordinary life, we treat free lunch as a metaphor for a system where costs are hidden, displaced, or paid by someone else. So the phrase actually raises questions rather than answering them. Who paid? Where did the givens come from? Why is there something rather than nothing? In that sense, the slogan functions as a rhetorical fog machine. It creates the feeling of understanding while avoiding the burden of clarity. Lennox's better framing is this: the universe is a given, but there is a giver. Even if you reject the conclusion, the structure of the argument is important. He is distinguishing between the fact that something is there and the reason it is there. Modern scientific descriptions excel at mapping patterns inside the universe, relations, regularities, mathematically expressible behavior. But when someone moves from "here is a law" to "therefore we don't need God," they have crossed into a different kind of claim, a metaphysical claim about ultimate reality. And that claim cannot be settled by catchy metaphors. This is why Lennox brings in the idea of explanation itself. Many people assume if science can describe how things behave, then science has explained why reality exists. But how and why are not competing answers. They are answers to different questions. Explaining combustion does not explain why there is matter to combust. Explaining gravity's equations does not explain why a universe exists in which such equations hold. Even in everyday reasoning, we know this difference. If you ask, "Why is the room lit?" you might accept "because the switch is on" as a partial explanation. But if you ask, "Why is there electricity? Why is there a building? Why is there a power grid?" you've moved into deeper explanatory layers. Science is powerful, but it does not automatically exhaust the hierarchy of explanation. The real sharpness here is that Lennox is not arguing against science. He is arguing against scientism, the belief that scientific description is the only valid form of truth. When Hawking, or any public intellectual, says we don't need God, that is not a scientific measurement. It is a worldview conclusion. And once we see that, the conversation becomes honest. We are no longer pretending that metaphysics is physics. So the core insight of this section is a warning. Don't let the elegance of a phrase replace the rigor of an argument. The question is not whether someone can say something that sounds clever. The question is whether it actually explains anything. Lennox's point stands. Sometimes what passes for explanation is simply a refusal to ask the next question. Let us now continue with the debate or discussion. This segment is a masterclass in exposing how easily modern discourse confuses a punchline with an explanation. Hawking's phrases are memorable, but Lennox asks a deeper question. What do we mean when we say we have explained something? That is not a minor semantic issue. It's the hidden hinge on which many popular claims about science and God turn. Consider the line, "The universe is the ultimate free lunch." Lennox does not merely disagree, he presses the logic. No lunch is ever free. That sounds like a joke, but it carries a philosophical point. Free is not an explanation. It's a conclusion smuggled in without argument. In ordinary life, we treat free lunch as a metaphor for a system where costs are hidden, displaced, or paid by someone else. So the phrase actually raises questions rather than answering them. Who paid? Where did the givens come from? Why is there something rather than nothing? In that sense, the slogan functions as a rhetorical fog machine. It creates the feeling of understanding while avoiding the burden of clarity. Lennox's better framing is this: the universe is a given, but there is a giver. Even if you reject the conclusion, the structure of the argument is important. He is distinguishing between the fact that something is there and the reason it is there. Modern scientific descriptions excel at mapping patterns inside the universe, relations, regularities, mathematically expressible behavior. But when someone moves from "here is a law" to "therefore we don't need God," they have crossed into a different kind of claim, a metaphysical claim about ultimate reality. And that claim cannot be settled by catchy metaphors. This is why Lennox brings in the idea of explanation itself. Many people assume if science can describe how things behave, then science has explained why reality exists. But how and why are not competing answers. They are answers to different questions. Explaining combustion does not explain why there is matter to combust. Explaining gravity's equations does not explain why a universe exists in which such equations hold. Even in everyday reasoning, we know this difference. If you ask, "Why is the room lit?" you might accept "because the switch is on" as a partial explanation. But if you ask, "Why is there electricity? Why is there a building? Why is there a power grid?" you've moved into deeper explanatory layers. Science is powerful, but it does not automatically exhaust the hierarchy of explanation. The real sharpness here is that Lennox is not arguing against science. He is arguing against scientism, the belief that scientific description is the only valid form of truth. When Hawking, or any public intellectual, says we don't need God, that is not a scientific measurement. It is a worldview conclusion. And once we see that, the conversation becomes honest. We are no longer pretending that metaphysics is physics. So the core insight of this section is a warning. Don't let the elegance of a phrase replace the rigor of an argument. The question is not whether someone can say something that sounds clever. The question is whether it actually explains anything. Lennox's point stands. Sometimes what passes for explanation is simply a refusal to ask the next question. Let us now continue with the debate or discussion.